Hi everyone, my name's John. Welcome back to my channel. I wanted to talk about a book that I read last September with another booktuber, actually. I read this with Bill Rutenberg last year, and I will tag Bill in the comments so he can give his own take on the book. I think we were pretty much of the same mind about it, but I don't want to put any words in Bill's mouth, so I'll let him speak for himself. These are only my own opinions, but I posted them and showed them to him, and I think he was pretty much on board with everything I had to say. Certainly most things, but I'll tag him and he can let you know. We read a book from the University of Chicago Press, and this book was called Inventing the Renaissance, The Myth of a Golden Age by Ada Palmer. And this came out last year in 2025, and it is an ambitious attempt. And when I say ambitious, all said and done, we're looking at nearly 750 pages. Not all of that is readable text. There's maybe 650 pages of readable text. But a pretty ambitious attempt at critically reassessing our understanding of the Italian Renaissance as a period defined solely by peace, prosperity, wealth, and artistic genius. All of these concepts that you always hear thrown around when talking about the Italian Renaissance. Instead, much like the Middle Ages that preceded it, the Renaissance was a time of dynastic wars, rampant nepotism, and accumulation of vast wealth in the hands of a very few number of people, as well as disease. Palmer's book urges us to carefully reconsider the ways that we think about the long arc of historiography, where it takes us, how it carves up historical time into seemingly arbitrary pieces, which is this perennial problem that historians refer to as periodization, and what we make of the pieces that those periods leave behind. Unfortunately, her efforts are riddled with a vast amount of information that isn't quite synthesized into a final argument, as well as people and ideas that are superficially picked over and never looked at again, leaving the reader to consider how to put together these pieces, but I'll get into that in a few minutes. On the surface of Palmer's argument, there is, I think, a pretty obvious claim. Once you scratch the surface of that argument, you can see how dubious assignations like the Golden Age, when we talk about the Renaissance, aren't really unique to the Renaissance. We fall into that same easy trap when we breathlessly refer to the 17th and 18th centuries as the Enlightenment, or we used to call the early Middle Ages the Dark Ages. Thankfully, the latter has been out of fashion for historians, at least for a few generations, but it continues to reinforce the use of the Dark Ages. That is, continues to reinforce in the popular imagination a time of backward ignorance, a decline of learning and culture, and a screeching halt to scientific progress. Of course, none of that is true, which is why we stopped using it in the first place. Palmer's point is that the age that followed it, the Renaissance, was, with its epithet of the Golden Age, and its reputation for being everything the Middle Ages weren't, is an assumption, or isn't a label, in need of just as much scrutiny as the Dark Ages. She uses lulzy prose, which goes weirdly out of its way to cater to readers the age of her students at the University of Chicago, a tone that is kind of gratingly at odds with the intellectual, scholarly seriousness of the book. But she opens strong with a clear and convincing argument, I think. Historians almost always usually import a kind of intellectual hobby horse into their writing, which shapes the way that they see history. She refers to these as X factors. Okay, and she uses three signal Renaissance historians and historians of the Renaissance, not writing during the Renaissance, but writing about it, to illustrate what these X factors could possibly be for three different people. The first is Jakob Burckhardt, the Swiss historian largely credited with the revival of the Renaissance in the middle of the 19th century, or at least the revival of the study of it. Burckhardt thought that the Renaissance was all about the invention of the modern creative self. But for Hans Baron, the Renaissance signaled the rise of civic participation in the Republican state. And for Paul Oscar Christeller, his X factor was the advent of the educational reforms of humanism and their emphasis on grammar, rhetoric, history, and the importance of moral philosophy. Palmer is really careful to state that these X factors are not historians' malicious attempt to mislead their readership, but rather complex outcomes of personal experiences and preferences and interests, the political circumstance each historian lived in, and the interests that drove them to study the Renaissance in the first place. Each historian, all of whom have been cumulatively vital to how we see the Renaissance today, had a view of the period which placed their own X factor, their own explanatory key to understand the era, at its center. But to quote a famous poet, the center cannot hold. Part 3 of her book takes up nearly half of the book's length and is a compilation of 15 potted mini-biographies. Why she includes them is a little bit questionable. I would love Bill to weigh in on this part too. Only a small handful of the figures they cover recur in the book so regularly that they would actually need a chapter-long biography, apart from the last and the lengthiest one, which is Machiavelli's biography. And I'll get into in a second why Machiavelli actually plays a pretty important role in the book. Many of the people who get standalone biographies on their own get only one or two mentions in the entire 650-page long book, like one of the greatest Franco-Flemish composers of the 16th century and one of my personal favorite composers ever, Walking to Pray, who I would have loved to read a 650-page standalone biography of all by himself, but he gets a little tiny one, fairly, because this book isn't about him and only mentions him once or twice. If anything, this middle section may lend the reader a little familiarity with the bewilderingly Byzantine and complex politics of 15th and 16th century Florence, especially the highly dysfunctional de' Medici family, but those new to the Florentine politics of the time will probably be left wondering why this section didn't merit an entire book of its own and why many of the figures weren't really integrated into the rest of the book. The rest of the book takes up the task of trying to incorporate the fascinating, important material about X factors that I talked about with the biographical information in part 3, but Palmer gets distracted by anything and everything that interests her instead of pushing forward with her once cogent argument. We get forays into consequentialists, deontological and virtue ethics, and a series of frantically posed questions like, was Florence trying to achieve a state informed by virtue ethics? Or, in what ways did Machiavelli see that trying to educate princes in the ways of philosophers was not enough? Or, what counts as atheism? Or, was Machiavelli an atheist? Or, was Machiavelli a humanist? It's like she's a cat trying to chase an aluminum ball of foil across the floor. Anything that interests her will make her pounce. Palmer's overall thesis, if you can cobble one together from the unnecessary bibliographies and lengthy asides about humanism and secularism and atheism that never really go anywhere, is that the readers of history should tread lightly when it comes to characterizing vast periods of time as defined by one singular, unique thing or as being caused by one thing above all others. History is always more organic, more multifaceted, and more dynamic than that. Burckhardt was right about a new kind of individualism, and Barron was right about Republican civic participation, and Christeller was right about the educational reforms of humanism. However, none of these alone provide an exhaustive explanation of what we recognize as the Renaissance. They were all important. For seasoned readers of history, this may be like preaching to the choir, but it's worth reiterating, especially when those singular X factors become politically charged to justify notions of progress, like how modernity is superior to religion. Because of this, the study of any period should range far and wide over the span of its historiography, lest we fall into the trap of accepting facile explanations for complex historical phenomenon. When we look back onto the past, we need to ask ourselves, what questions impelled this historian to write about this history? Did they have any grand overarching explanations? Explanations that they may not be able to justify? If so, where do they succeed in their history? Where do they fail? In the hands of a good editor, I think this book could have been fascinating, a really good lesson in how to avoid the many pitfalls and fallacies to which many of us fall victim when reading history, like thinking that we have the answer to a problem, the insight into an age, that ideas like secularism or humanism are equally applicable and used in the same across all of history and all of time, etc. The more of these mistakes we can sidestep, the better we can read history cautiously and critically, realizing that it can be used as both a cudgel that oversimplifies and narrows our historical understanding, or it can enrich us and teach us and enthrall us without our all too human need to impose order on it by trying to explain it away with one-dimensional catch-all explanations. So I know that's a long-winded review, and Bill is most certainly not going to want to type out a long-winded comment, but I would love Bill to post something to memorialize our reading of this book. Even if I didn't love the book, it does raise some interesting questions and brings up some interesting ideas that everyone should keep in mind when reading history. And of course, reading a book with Bill Rutenberg is always a pleasurable experience. So if you watch this, Bill, thanks for reading it with me. Maybe we can read something this year too. I would love to do it. This is Inventing the Renaissance, The Myth of a Golden Age by Ada Palmer, who apparently writes fiction as well. So if you're interested in some of the fiction that she writes, go check out her name. I will see you later with another review. Bye.